Surely this commandment that I am commanding you is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us, so that we may hear it and observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross to the other side of the sea for us, and get it for us, so that we may hear it and observe it? No, the word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Hello all. My apologies for not being physically present, but I don't think any of you want what's going around my household right now. I have tried recording this a couple of times, but have been interrupted by children and others needing things, so hopefully this time I'll get all the way through. Now, our reading today comes from the book of Deuteronomy, and I want to talk a bit about that book as a whole before we start digging into kind of the specifics of what we read today, because it is a fascinating text if you look at its composition and history. And so part of the beauty of the book of Deuteronomy, which is this large collection of stories and laws, it's very much in many ways like Exodus, which contains both actual kind of narrative stories and then segments of specific rules or liturgical components and things like that. And that's intentional. But part of it is because the book was written in multiple separate phases, from what we can tell. Now, first, there's a good reason to suspect that at least some of the material dates to somewhere around the time that Israel in the northern kingdom, so when Israel and Judah split after King Solomon into a northern and southern kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed by Assyria in 721 BCE. And there's a reason to suspect that some of the religious documents from the north managed to travel south into Jerusalem. So escaping priests from the north, from Samaria, would have made their way down with some of their religious texts. And while before the kingdom split, they were probably working with more or less copies of the same documents. Through this significant intervening period, of course, changes occur and additional material is added. And so some of these documents, which were similar but slightly different, made their way back south to Jerusalem. And you end up having the king at the time in Jerusalem making some meaningful religious reforms with the influx of new holy documents. The bulk of the material, however, seems to occur after that and may in fact be the impetus for the reforms of King Josiah in 621 BCE, about a century later. So if you look at a lot of the things that Josiah does, if you read the books of Kings and Chronicles, where it goes through kind of the various leaders in the north and the south and some of the various things that they do, Josiah makes major reforms, and a lot of those reforms seem to coincide with some of the more legal, technical components of Deuteronomy. So like I said, when these texts came in from the north, someone presumably stashed them away in the temple, and eventually they were found, and somebody kind of edited it up to fit in and said, hey, look, we have these books of law that we haven't been utilizing because they weren't original documents from the south. And so, hey, we should probably look at working with these. Conveniently, a lot of these rules and changes and whatnot address significant issues that probably would have been facing the Hebrew community at the time because of the pressures going on from Assyria and Babylon and Egypt and a lot of these surrounding major players. For hundreds of years, Israel and Judah really only had to contend with other relatively small kingdoms around them. The Edomites and the Moabites and the Philistines and some of these various groups around them. But as the Iron Age really comes to a head here, starting with Assyria, and they keep getting invaded and they keep getting annexed and have these issues, there's all kinds of social and religious pressures on them. And in a very real way, Deuteronomy responds directly to the issues relevant sort of at the time. The final stage of Deuteronomy, though, is probably finalized in the form that we have it now, somewhere around 535 BCE. This is the Judean restoration. So this is after Babylon falls and all of the Israelite captives, all the Jewish captives in Babylon are allowed to return to Judah and rebuild. And now conveniently, there are significant narrative and connective components in this text that fit perfectly with that because, intentionally so, the narrative of Deuteronomy places it in the context of Moses leading the people out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. And so in a kind of a beautiful mirrored way, the book, narratively placed at the time of returning to the Promised Land from captivity in Egypt, is chronologically produced and made available at the time that the Jews are returning to that same Promised Land from captivity in Babylon. And it therefore provides a very nice kind of reiteration of a lot of the contents of Exodus. It does a lot of updates, a lot of commentary and modification, and it makes it sort of more streamlined. And this is why there's so much kind of repetition between Exodus and Deuteronomy, including the Ten Commandments. Although the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy are actually a little different than those in Exodus. There's a lot of these little changes and updates and things that try to make it more relevant for the time that they are now in and the reality that they now face. Maybe someday we'll get into the Ten Commandments different. I'm not saying it's a radical difference, just that it's different. But because these changes occur as a combination of political realignment and combining documents, you get some weirdness in Deuteronomy. So for instance, here's just one fun example. Deuteronomy 23:3 prohibits Moabites from becoming part of the assembly, from being considered actually Hebrew people, from being Jews, out to 10 generations. Now, Israel and Judah both had problems with Moab. This is a neighboring kingdom to them. And some of those, there's stories that go all the way back to the book of Exodus, where the Moabites are trying to stop them from entering this land. But also, shortly before the exile to Babylon, both Israel and Judah had significant conflict with Moab. So both in their long-range memory and in their more recent memory, Moab was a problem. So Deuteronomy says, no, Moabites cannot become part of our people. Their descendants don't count as part of the assembly, as part of us for 10 generations. But the problem you run into with that is if you read the book of Ruth, or if we jump ahead to the New Testament in Matthew and you read through the genealogies of Jesus, you see this slight problem. And I'm looking at Ruth 4:17, where David himself, King David, is only 3 generations from a Moabite. His great-grandmother was a Moabite. And thus, King David doesn't count as Hebrew or Jewish under the laws of Deuteronomy. Now, this wasn't really an issue hundreds of years later, where they're currently at. But if you think of this as a text in operation at the time, that would mean David and the family he's come from, well, they can't be part of the assembly. I mean, there's no contention over that anywhere in the actual stories of David. So, there's some fun, weird stuff like that. Now, getting to this part that we read specifically for today. We're near the end of Deuteronomy, this renewal of the covenant and discussion of following it. Now, remember, the people who are probably reading this historically now are the people coming back from Babylon into their homeland. And they hear this, that this isn't too difficult. The commandment is not too hard. It's not far away. It's not across the sea or up in heaven. It's right here. We can hold it in our hands. We can see it. We can read it. We can learn it in our mouth and in our heart, which sort of brings up the imagery from the prophets, even though the content of Deuteronomy is quite different than that of a lot of the prophets. The idea that it's accessible in a way that it often wasn't to people. The fact that in most communities where they're familiar, in Babylon, the average person doesn't get to hear necessarily or have access to these laws or rules or things. And here is a document that they have that's not hidden away exclusively for the priests, but it is read aloud and made available. Even most people can't read. They still require someone to read it and explain it. But here's the law. We know the rules. And it's interesting as part of Christianity because the early church, and still today doctrinally, took the position that it is impossible, right, to satisfy the full extent of the law for us. This is why Jesus becomes necessary, because even though we have this, concise is definitely the wrong word, but we have this fairly limited set of rules and expectations. We can't seem to make it work for us all the time. So instead, the early church still did take the position that through Christ, at least, it was possible to live the way we were meant to live. The law was an attempt. Deuteronomy is an attempt to create a way of life that is good, that is balanced and fair and just and equitable and faithful. And as Christians, we can look to Jesus and the early church examples in the saints as a way of living life that is those things as well. But the difference becomes one of interpretation. And this is where Christianity and the early church would look at these texts and say, well, the law isn't possible, but the spirit of the law is. And I know I've talked about this a couple of times. This is where the prophets get their idea that it isn't necessarily the exact letter of the law that we are ever really meant to uphold. Those laws are tools. They exist for a purpose. They exist to try and lead us in a right direction internally, morally, spiritually, emotionally, in a way that creates the kind of life that matters. And I think this gets hidden partly in translation. So there's this part of today's reading in 16 where it talks about loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances. That if we do those, we shall live and become numerous and bless the land, so on. And I want to go through some of those words real quick because I think we've talked about some of these words, and it makes more sense when you read them in their full kind of connotation. So, walking in his ways, that's pretty direct. The idea of following the path. Early Christianity, by the way, didn't refer to itself as Christianity. It referred to itself as the way, the people of the way. So this follows right into this. But observing commandments, decrees, and ordinances. Commandments, I don't inherently have a problem with the translation, but the word here, mitzvah, means both something that is commanded, an order, an expectation, but it also means the good thing that one does in following it. So that it isn't just don't do this, but that not doing this is a good thing. Or it isn't just you shall do this. It's saying doing this is itself a mitzvah. It is a command. And so mitzvah means both the rule and the action one takes, the good deed one does in following that rule. It works both ways. So observing the good acts, the good deeds, as well as decrees. This is chukah. It's a hard one in English. It starts with a you got to kind of clear your throat. Chukah. This word is used both for kind of standard political ordinances, specific rules and decrees. It's used for regular day-to-day law stuff. But from God, it's often associated with things that are decreed as things owed in terms of time. It often comes up with holidays and rituals that are set aside. It isn't just you shall do this. Those are mostly commandments. The decrees are more about the Sabbath and about the festivals and the holidays. You will follow these rules of community and celebration and set those aside as holy. So the wording makes it sound like it's about filing your taxes on time, but it's more of about setting aside time and space to celebrate and remember and devote that time to the good things. The final word, ordinances, is terrible. This is where this word is mishpat, and mishpat we've talked about several times now. This is about justice and judgment. This is about making a system and a space that is fair and equitable. And so if we read it as ordinances, it once again sounds just like rules, but this isn't about rules as much as it's about justice and judgment and figuring out how to be fair with everyone involved. So, is it possible for us to follow and obey these rules and commands? Is it possible for us to satisfy the law? Can we do as the text says and acknowledge that this isn't too hard? Because it isn't about following all of the rules. It's about doing the good deeds. It's about setting aside the time and space. It's about ensuring justice and goodness. These things are totally possible. This is what Christianity focuses on, that it is the spirit of the law. It isn't about making sure on this day of this month we sacrifice this many doves or something. It's about making sure that we, in fact, are dedicating ourselves to these doing good works and setting aside these important festivals and celebrations, reminding ourselves of what's important and making sure justice is done. Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. It's the same kind of thing. And the beauty of it is Christianity, our faith, our system of belief, when we live it in this way, when we make it about the good things and about justice and about kindness and about taking care of people, when we read the law for the spirit of the law, for the purpose and the goal of the law, we do well. The early church did very, very well when it became less concerned with about the technicalities of all of the rules and following every particular action. And it became more concerned about trying to strive for the goals of those rules. When we as a people are not known for these things, when we are known for being the legalists and focused on the technicalities and focused on what is accepted and what isn't, when we get focused on the letter, the words of the text, not their spirit, not their living embodiment, not the goal in which they had, when the text isn't about love, but law, then we don't do so well as a whole. And so I think the reminder today, looking at Deuteronomy, a text that probably did consider itself much more interested in the letter than in the spirit of it. This is sort of a reminder for us as Christians that we are bound to the spirit of the law, that the law isn't going away, as Jesus makes very clear. It's not being abolished, but it is about satisfying it in the way it was intended, which is to say, by living it out in goodness and kindness and justice and mercy. That it is, in fact, not too far away for us. It is near and dear to us to seek all of these things. And being reminded of the ways that our ancient forebears in the faith sought to fulfill these ideals and live them out can help us imagine ever new and amazing ways to hold them near and dear to our hearts and live them out today. Amen.